This morning we are continuing our journey through Genesis chapters 2 and 3, reading some translations of these texts by the Reverend Dr. Will Gaffney, who I mentioned last week is a professor of Hebrew Bible at Bright Divinity School in Fort Worth. And she has this wonderful women's lectionary for the whole church that she has gifted to the world. So I'll be reading again this week from her translation, Genesis 3. The woman and man heard the sound of the sovereign God walking about in the garden in the breezy part of the day. And the woman and her man hid themselves from the presence of the sovereign God among the trees of the garden. Then the sovereign God called to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" And the man said, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself." Then God said, "Who told you that you were naked? Did you eat from the tree that I commanded you not to eat?" And the man said, "The woman whom you gave to me to stand with me, she gave me the fruit, and I ate." Then the sovereign God said to the woman, "What is this that you have done?" The woman said, "The serpent deceived me, and I ate." Then the sovereign God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you among all herd animals and among all wild creatures. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. Her offspring will strike your head, and you will strike the heel of her offspring." To the woman God said, "I will greatly increase your painful toil and your pregnancies. In pain you shall birth children, and your desire shall be for your man, yet he shall rule over you. Yet he shall rule with you." And to the man God said, "Because you have listened to the voice of your woman and have eaten of the tree which I commanded you, you shall not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In painful toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorn and thistle shall it grow for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow shall you eat bread until you return to the ground. From out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return." The man named his wife Eve because she was the mother of all the living. And the sovereign God made garments of skins for the woman and her man and clothed them. The word of God for the people of God. So what happens after Adam and Eve consume that forbidden fruit and choose the path that leads toward wisdom, but out of the paradise of the garden. What does this choice do to their covenant with God? And how will they endure the range of human suffering that follows? What can this origin story teach us about the love of God in the midst of calamity? I think I don't need to spend much time telling you about life after Eden. I think we all have a pretty good idea of what it feels like not to live in paradise. After Eden, when you have to keep making hard choices, and the rules and the right decisions aren't always perfectly clear, when the world and its systems aren't fair or just, and some folks bear more than their share of the burden, when so much is out of your control and yet at the same time you are held accountable for everything you do control. Phyllis Tribble, the scholar I talked about a couple Sundays ago, says that these verses that we just read show how terrible human life has become as it stands between creation and grace. She says we must take great care, though, as we read these descriptions of the aftermath of Eden. She says we must take care not to see these so much as judgments or punishments from God, but more like descriptions of what will ensue as a result of Adam and Eve's choice. Now, there's some debate about how to translate some of these verses. And one of the places that there's debate is the part that I slipped up and read and then had to correct myself. Traditionally, it's been translated, and Phyllis Tribble does this herself, that God's description of what life will be is that the husband shall rule over the woman. Dr. Gaffney doesn't translate it that way. But in that tension is precisely where the tension of these verses in chapter 3 reside. Even Dr. Tribble, who says that this statement in chapter 3, verse 16, has been used as a license for male supremacy, says that though this is what happens after Eden, this is not the creation pattern that God intended. Subjugation and supremacy are perversions of creation, not part of the design. For both Dr. Tribble and Dr. Gaffney, they are careful to point out that these judgments, these descriptions about what happens after Eden, are very much culturally conditioned. Childbearing, painful childbearing, and caring for her husband will become the woman's lot. Work, farming specifically, and wife will become the destiny of the man. She says that to be faithful translators of these scriptures, we must recognize that women as well as men and non-binary folks move beyond culturally defined roles often. And yet we all have culturally formed stereotypes. But these too are judgments upon our common sin and disobedience. She says, the suffering and oppression we as people experience now are marks of our fall, not of our creation. Dr. Tribble goes on to say that these descriptions of what life will be like in the days ahead are not the way God intended. The creation stories in Genesis 1 and 2 describe a world of equality and mutuality, while Genesis 3 describes a world of subjugation and supremacy and oppression. After Eden, things are pretty rotten. But after Eden, there's also the possibility for a change, for a return to our true liberation under God. And the one thing that hasn't changed after Eden is God's loving commitment to God's creation. We see this most vividly in the final verse that I read, where God himself crafts clothing for the humans who are now ashamed of their nakedness. God is both creator and seamstress, doing whatever is necessary to continue to care for humanity. I'm not sure if the artwork is on the screen yet. This artwork is from a Ukrainian artist named Danilo Movchan. I probably said that really poorly. He's an artist who resides in Lviv. You might recognize the name of that city because it was bombed on Friday, hit by six missile strikes. It's on the western side of Ukraine, near the border with Poland, and up until this point had been seen as a fairly safe refuge from the fighting that was going on in the more eastern and southern parts of Ukraine. This artist is well known for his contemporary icons and other forms of religious art. You can see them in churches around the country and in museums like the online Kyiv Gallery. I read a little bit about his approach to religious imagery, and one of the things that he mentioned is that in his religious art, when he is depicting the nature of the divine, the state of our origins in God, the image of a womb or womb-like images are ones that he returns to repeatedly. This is his painting called Expulsion from the Garden. I'm not an art critic, and as we know, people see different things in images. But it looks to me like that there's something womb-like about that garden. the womb where we begin our lives, all of us, where all of our nutrients are provided for us, where the body of the one who bears us provides all of the safety and security that we need. And the womb, which from the moment that we exit, life begins to be somewhat less secure. Even if it's good, even if we have parents who care for us carefully, we can't go back into the womb. And yet, one of the major tasks of a spiritual life is to practice our connection with the womb-like source of our being, so that somehow we learn to live and love out of a relative sense of safety and security, of faith and trust over fear. Even when the bombs are going off around us, either metaphorical or absolutely literal. This is what the spiritual disciplines are all about. Prayer and meditation and contemplation. The living that we do in covenant relationships with other humans. These things help us to remember that though we can never go back into the womb in quite the same way, it is within the matrix of God's love that we live and move and have our being. A colleague of mine was recently describing a period of time a long time ago, maybe 10 years ago in her own life, when she describes a kind of conversion experience that she had, a kind of Easter resurrection. She had been going through a really dark time, making bad choices by her own account, living with a lot of unresolved trauma and not knowing what path to choose, not having a sense of purpose or healthy relationships to rely on. She described that period as a really dark time. Then she described the period after her resurrection also as a dark time. Digging through painful emotions and working through hard memories and making hard choices about how to go in a new direction. She said the difference was between a darkness that was lonely and the darkness when you know you're not alone. That, my friends, is what it means to live after Eden. To know that at the depths of your loneliness, when all around you it seems that the world is falling apart, when the problems seem insurmountable, to know that if you dig deep enough, underneath it all, love remains. The love which has been with us since our birth. Love remains. As a preacher, it doesn't feel like much to offer you. But if you've ever lived through that kind of darkness I was just describing, you know that that is the most reliable thing a preacher can offer. That the foundation of the world and the place to which we will all eventually return is love. In closing, I invite you to hear the words of the poem Love Remains. It's a new piece written by Karen Georgia A. Thompson, who's one of our associate general ministers in the United Church of Christ. She writes, "Destruction visits again. Tornadoes sweeping through the night skies, people displaced, their cries cutting the crisp morning air. The explosion of volcanoes thought long asleep moves the earth, lava creating new roads, ashes falling like snow from the skies in tropical places. We see our longing. Love remains. Tears visit coursing cheeks stained by dirt and marred by grief. In the den haunting the piles of debris and devastation, children stare, stunned by the displacement of the known. The silence of helping hands emerge. We touch our hope. Love remains. Chaos sweeps in with spring on floods and rising waters from melting winter snow, overwhelmed lakes overstepping their sensible banks. Swollen rivers charting new courses, taking with them homes and lands and crops. We watch, aggrieved as yet again lives are disrupted. We hear our courage. Love remains. Our loved ones are dead, our siblings homeless. With no words enough to express the losses, we weep in disbelief of what we see unfolding among us. We stand wounded and broken in the acridity coursing through the air after the fires. We hold each other tightly with the love unfurling around us. We feel our strength. Love remains. Love, defying words we cannot find, holds our fears and our tears, tending to our despair, dispensing hope. We stretch our arms across the miles. We stand together, giving what we have, sharing with those in need. We give thanks, sharing God's love. We extend beyond ourselves one more time. Because in this great hour unfolding infinitely, we live out generosity. We smell the sweetness of our unity. Love remains. And all comes down around us. Love remains. Amen.